Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. Chapter 12. This chapter contains mentions of sexual harassment in the workplace, police brutality, and homophobia. Please listen at your own discretion. I still remember the moment Jan and I walked into the cannery and I saw Teresa, standing right there in front of me. She was working on a machine, coring apples. I was trying to get a better look at her, wondering what color her hair was under that white paper net. "You coming or not?" the foreman asked me. I hung back for a moment. Her smile told me she already knew she had my complete attention. Even when we were filling our forms in the foreman's office, I still felt floored and flustered. Teresa never stopped affecting me just that much. The foreman noticed, but he must not have cared because he assigned me to work on the line near her. I watched as each woman put an apple on a spindle and pressed a foot pedal. The apples spun around and were peeled and cored in the process. All of it landed on a conveyor belt headed toward me. Just past me, the conveyor split into two belts. The foreman handed me a stick. I looked at it stupidly. He told me to hit the cores and peels one way, the apples another. "That's it?" I asked. He snorted and walked away. Thus began my short-lived career as an apple hitter. I knew Teresa was watching, so I wanted to do it suavely, but that was kind of stretching it, considering the task. "What are you doing?" she asked me. I shrugged. "I'm inspecting the apples, quality of the fruit, wormholes, efficiency of the coring and peeling operation." She threw her head back and smiled. "You mean you're an apple bopper?" "Yeah," I laughed. "Something like that." "Hey, you asshole!" someone at the end of the conveyor belts yelled. Okay, so I had let a few peels go down the apple belt. Big deal. Teresa laughed softly and went back to her work. She was playing with me. This flirtation was one of life's unexpected pleasures. Almost as soon as it started, it ended. The foreman announced he was moving me. "I could do a better job hitting these apples," I insisted. I followed him to another part of the plant where the actual canning was done. The noise terrified me. The foreman pointed to a Y-shaped conveyor belt running parallel to the ceiling. I saw a guy up there straddling a giant pipe near the point where the conveyor belt split into two. Every few seconds, a carton came down the single belt. He diverted them alternatively one way or another. I was replacing him. The foreman showed me a metal pole with footholds. I waited for the guy who was already up there to climb down, but he swung down from pipe to pipe, brushed off his hands, and walked away. I assumed he had been doing this job for a while. I had hoped I could climb above the din, but both the height and the roar made me nervous. This job looked like it required all the skill and judgment of apple bopping, but although it wasn't a complex task, it sure wasn't as easy as it first appeared. The cartons were packed with heavy cans of applesauce. They hurled at me with tremendous velocity, and I had to hit them to divert them. I nearly fell off. I learned to hit the boxes from an angle, not head-on. After I got the hang of it, I realized what an interesting vantage point I had. I'd never seen the life of a factory from a bird's-eye view. The arrangement of the machines, the sequence of interrelatedness of tasks, the organized scurrying of workers. I noticed a ruckus near the women's bathroom. Butch Jan squared off with two women and a man. It was a fight I'd engaged in many times, but never watched safely as a third party. Jan stood with hands on hips and her mouth moving like she was shouting. I could see how defensive and embarrassed she felt by watching her body. I never would have heard the foreman yelling for me below. He banged a hammer against a metal pipe connected to the one I was sitting on. The vibration startled me, and the next box almost took me over and down. He pointed to his watch. It must be lunchtime. I met up with Jan in the cafeteria. She was upset because some women in the bathroom claimed they thought she was a man. They said God didn't create women to look like men. "Then explain me," Jan answered them. I laughed as she told the story, but it really wasn't funny. I saw that good-looking femme come in, but Jan was sputtering mad, and I wanted to hear her out. "They said they thought I was a man when they saw my tattoos." Jan hit the lunch table. I said, "If you really thought I was a man, you'd have run out of the bathroom yelling." I nodded. She was right. The woman sat at the table with her friends. I swore she was checking me out. Jan glanced over her shoulder to see what I was looking at. "See something you like on the menu?" Jan laughed. I squirmed in my seat. "Aw, she's probably just playing with me." "Like hell she is." Jan sounded in the know. "What do you mean?" I shot back. I heard she asked someone what your name was. You're kidding me. I don't believe it. Jan looked wounded. No, really? I got my hopes up. Then they sunk. Oh, it probably doesn't mean a thing, I concluded. Jan smiled like there was something else. Well, she did ask if you were single. My jaw dropped. I couldn't recover my composure. For Christ's sake, be cool, Jan patted my arm. Jan, what's her name? Teresa. I savored her name, repeating it over in my mind. When you do that, it's a sign something big is happening to your heart. At the end of the day, I looked for Teresa at the time clock, but she was hidden in the wave of hundreds of workers leaving and hundreds more entering for the next shift. I didn't talk much on the bus ride home. I just stared out the window. Jan laughed softly and shook her head. The next day, I could hardly wait to get to work. Jan and I were assigned to load trucks. It was heavy work. I was leaning up against a pole, smoking a cigarette, when Teresa walked by to go to the bathroom. Actually, the bathroom was in the opposite direction. I felt embarrassed because I was dripping with sweat and my white t-shirt was filthy. Teresa smiled. I like sweaty butches, she said, as though she'd read my mind. Man, those boxes sailed out of my hands all day as though they were filled with feathers. For the next week, I didn't sleep much. I leaped out of bed as soon as the alarm rang and rode the long distance out to the cannery in excited anticipation. I saw Teresa at least twice a shift. I was floating a foot off the ground. Then one day, Jan pulled me aside after a break. Got some bad news for you, kid. Teresa had been fired. The general superintendent called her into his office to go over his 6-month review. That's when he grabbed her breasts. Jan said Teresa kicked him in the shin, yelled at him, and then kicked him in the other shin. Good for her. Anyway, he fired her. I crashed from the summit of euphoria. It was just a job after that. Worse, really, because it had been so much fun. I knew it was time to ask the temp agency for another assignment. The following Friday night, I showered and dressed up. When I got to Abba's, I was glad I had. There was Teresa, leaning on the bar. I had never expected to see her again. She had cajoled some friends into driving her to Buffalo to look for me. Lucky for me, there was only one gay bar at a time. The hue of Teresa's hair reminded me of the lustrous colors of a chestnut. It was well worth waiting to see her. Her eyes didn't hide how happy she was to see me. I think she would have liked to hug me, but she restrained herself. So did I. I kissed the cheek she offered me. I saw Grant near the jukebox. A moment later, I heard Stand By Your Man playing. Thanks, Grant. I asked Teresa to dance. She took her time smoothing my collar and adjusting my tie before she led me to the dance floor. We moved beautifully together. Meg told me later that we looked as good as Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. All the while we were dancing, Teresa traced the back of my neck above my collar with her fingernails. She was driving me mad. I guess that was the point. I know I was driving her crazy too, but I was being very, very careful doing it. Sometimes when you move just a little, carefully, it's a whole lot more powerful than grinding. When the song finished, I let go of her, but Teresa pulled me back. I wasn't trying to be mean to you at the plant. Did you think I was? No, it felt good. She smiled. I don't think I was very nice to you. I was just teasing you to get your attention. I liked you. I blushed. Nobody ever flirted with me outside the bar before. I mean, in the real world, you know? It made me feel normal. She nodded like she really understood. We talked for a while about our lives. She was a rural girl from Appleton. She came right out and told me she got her friends to drive her to this bar just to look for me. Then someone tapped Teresa on the shoulder. The women she rode to Buffalo with were leaving. She took my face in both her hands and kissed my mouth. I blushed from head to toe. She stood back and grinned at my color, proud of her work. I'll make you dinner at my house next Saturday night if you want, she offered. You're on, I said, still blushing. She scribbled her phone down on a cocktail napkin. Call me, she shouted over her shoulder. You can bet on it, I answered. I was still blushing. You would have thought I'd won the Kentucky Derby the way everybody came over to congratulate me. I felt like $1,000,000. I just wondered if I'd ever stop blushing. It took me all day Saturday to get ready. Pick out the right clothes, bathe, shower again. Then there were the questions like which tie, cologne or no cologne. Something so sweet took a lot of care. I brought Teresa daffodils. When I handed them to her, her eyes filled with tears. I had a feeling nobody had treated her like someone special before. I silently vowed to always make her feel that way. "I'll just be a minute," she called out from the kitchen. I was glad for the time to nose around her living room and get a sense of her. One thing I could tell for sure. She loved dried wildflowers. "Ready," she called out moments later. "Do you mind eating here in the kitchen?" I'd never eaten anyplace else. She'd made me a steak and mashed potatoes with gravy. God, it looked delicious. Then she put a mound of soft, green stuff on my plate. "What's that?" I asked as politely as I could. "Spinach," she said, locking me into her gaze. I circled it with my fork. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "I just never eat vegetables, that's all." Teresa took off her oven glove. She sat down on a kitchen chair next to me and took both my hands in her hands. "Never say never," she said. "We're too young to close the door to anything in our lives." I discovered I was already in love with her. Actually, I found out spinach isn't all that bad either, if you put lots of butter and salt on it. After dinner, I helped her wash the dishes and clean up. Then, by the sink, we moved close to each other. I felt shy. That turned out to be okay. Gently, we kissed each other. Our tongues discovered a silent language to express our needs. Once we started, we never wanted to stop. That's how it began. Within a month, we rented a U-Haul trailer and moved into a new apartment together in Buffalo. Teresa negotiated with the landlord. He lived in Kenmore, so we hoped he'd never actually see me. We got real furniture. I mean, it was Salvation Army, but it was real. Our names were printed inside a heart on the dish towel that hung on the refrigerator door handle. We got it made at Crystal Beach. It was a brave thing to do. But later, we spilled loganberry juice on it, so we used it for dishes because we couldn't bring ourselves to throw it out. And there were marigolds in amber glasses on the windowsill, daisies in a green-cut glass vase on the kitchen table, fresh mint and basil growing in a flower box on the porch. It was a home. I grew up in leaps and bounds. I tried to reduce the anxieties of life by paying bills on time, keeping receipts and promises, doing laundry before I ran out of underwear, picking up after myself. Most importantly, I learned to say I'm sorry. This relationship was too vital to let dust accumulate in its corners. I began to realize how emotionally wounded I was, how damaged. But Teresa could always sense when I was about to petrify like stone. She could see it coming by the way I held my body as I walked in the door. She could hear it building up in the stories of life's daily abuses, on the job, at the corner store, on the street. Those were the times she would tell me stories in bed, wonderful, sensuous, tactile fantasies about how your body feels when you're lying on sand in the sun and the ocean waves are lapping near your toes, or climbing worn wooden stairs to visit a quaint sunlit room where a lover awaits. The stories were relaxation therapy and sexual fantasy combined, meant to simultaneously calm and arouse me. They did both. Teresa could always melt my stone. It was 1968. Revolution seemed to glimmer on the horizon. Millions took to the streets in protest. The world was exploding with change. Everywhere, that is, except in the factories where I worked. Every morning at dawn, we punched in as usual. We only dreamed at night. It wasn't that we didn't know there was a war raging. There were hardly any draft-age guys in the plants anymore. Co-workers who were absent for several days were assumed to have lost a husband, son, or brother. The ashen grief on their faces when they returned to work confirmed the fact. I knew there was a war. I wasn't stupid. I just didn't know what on earth I could do about it. It was Teresa's job as a secretary at the university that opened a window, allowing me to feel the hurricane force of change. She brought home leaflets, pamphlets, and underground newspapers. I read about Black power and women's liberation. I began to understand that outrage against the war was much deeper and more organized than I'd realized. "There's campus rallies and protests almost every day now," she told me. "Not just against the war, but to open up the schools to everybody." Teresa ordered home subscriptions to the morning and evening papers. One day, she left a copy of the latter on the couch. It was a magazine put out by a group called the Daughters of Bilitis. I didn't know who Bilitis was. I'd never seen anything about women like us in the print before. "Where'd you get this?" I shouted to her. She called back from the kitchen. "In the mail." "You got this sent to our address in the mail? Was it wrapped? What if someone in the building saw it?" After a long silence, Teresa came in with a hand mirror and held it up to my face. "Did you think you were a secret?" Teresa needed a root canal, but she couldn't get any overtime at the university. So when the temp agency offered me a triple shift at the electronics plant, I jumped at the chance. Teresa wondered if the emergency production at the factory had something to do with the war. In any case, we needed the money, so I took it. I started the triple on Thursday evening. What a killer. By the end of the third shift, I could scarcely feel the wires as I soldered. I kept burning my index finger with the red-hot iron. Teresa was out when I got home Friday night. I left her a note, stumbled into bed, and lost consciousness. When I woke up, she was lying next to me, smoking one of my cigarettes. I knew something was up. She didn't smoke. Teresa left the room and came back with ointment and band-aids for my finger. "Did you hear Dr. King was killed?" she asked me. I lit a cigarette and lay back down. "Yeah, I heard about it Thursday night at work. What day is today, anyway?" "It's Saturday afternoon," she said. "There's been rioting all over the place. And Jess," Teresa sighed, "there was real trouble at the bar last night." I felt a pang of jealousy. "You went without me?" Teresa smoothed my hair. "It was Grant's birthday, remember?" I smacked my forehead. "Fuck, I forgot. How was the party?" Teresa reached for another one of my cigarettes. I grabbed her hand. "Whoa, what's going on?" "There was a big fight last night. A fist fight," she said. I frowned. "Are you okay?" Teresa nodded. "Cops?" I asked. She shook her head. "Well, what happened?" Teresa took a deep breath. "The army notified Grant's family Thursday night that her brother got killed. Grant was already drunk when she showed up to the party. At first, everyone was consoling her. Then, some of the older butches who did hitches in the service started talking about the war. Some of the things they were saying didn't sit right with everyone." I listened quietly. "Grant said we ought to drop an A-bomb on Vietnam. She said no one would miss them. Ed told Grant she was a racist and said we should bring all the soldiers home. Ed said she felt like Muhammad Ali and that she didn't have beef with any of the people over there. Grant called her a communist." I shook my head and started to speak. Teresa put her finger up against my lips. "It got much worse, honey," she said. "Grant said some terrible things about King being killed, about the riots. She wouldn't stop. So Ed hit her." I crushed out my cigarette. "Oh, shit." "Anyway," Teresa continued, "Grant got Ed up against the bar, choking her. Peaches hauled off and pounded Grant on the head with her high heel. Other people got involved just because they were drunk. Ed's face got cut up. Grant got a concussion, and now Meg is saying no blacks will be allowed back at Abba's for a while." I couldn't believe what she was saying. "Shit, Teresa, what did you do?" Teresa looked me dead in the eyes. "When Grant tried to hit Peaches over the head with a bar stool, I cracked Grant over the head with a beer bottle and knocked her out. I'm barred from Abba's too." I leaned forward and kissed her on the lips. "It sounds like a mess." I sat up. "I'd better call Ed and see if she's okay," I said. Teresa tugged my arm. "Come here, baby. Don't call yet." "Why not?" Teresa shrugged. "What are you going to say to Ed?" "I don't know. I just want to make sure she's okay. I just think we all shouldn't be fighting each other. We need to stick together." Teresa nodded as though I'd confirmed something she already knew. She pulled me against her body. A wave of exhaustion rolled over me. "Be careful," Teresa whispered. "Think first before you call Ed." I pulled back my head and studied her face. I never could read that woman's mind. "Let's go somewhere," she said. I moaned. "I'm too tired." Teresa grabbed a handful of my hair and pulled my head back. "Too tired to neck with me behind a sand dune at Beaver Island?" I knew enough to surrender early. "Okay, all right. Should we take the car?" Teresa shook her head. "Get the bike out of the garage." "Are you crazy?" I laughed. "It's cold." Teresa slid her hands around my waist. "It's April, honey. Let's live like it's already spring." The moment we swung our legs over the Norton, I knew it was a good decision. It felt so good to turn into the curves together. One of Teresa's hands slid down to my thigh. I revved the engine in response. The cold wind sucked the laughter from our mouths. We rode slowly past the island marsh. Teresa pointed to a flock of wild geese headed north. The beach itself was almost deserted. A couple of mothers meandered along the boardwalk with their toddlers. We flopped down on the sand in front of the boardwalk. The sun was strong and warm. We could hear a radio playing faintly in the distance. I leaned up against a dune and spread my legs. Teresa curled up between my thighs and leaned back against me. I wrapped my arms around her and closed my eyes. The sound of lapping water and cawing gulls soothed all the tightness from my muscles. "Honey," she said. Something in her tone made my muscles tense again. "You and I never really talk about the war. I don't even know how you feel about it." My lips were close to her cheek. "I read those leaflets you bring home." Teresa turned to look at me. "But what do you think?" I shrugged. "What do you mean? I hate wars. But JFK didn't ask me if I wanted to start one. They're gonna do what they want to do. Why are you asking me this?" Teresa pulled my knees against her sides with her elbows. "I hate this war, Jess. It's got to stop. There's protest rallies on campus almost every day. If anyone from the staff gets spotted at one, we can get fired. But I'm thinking about going to the big rally next week anyway." I whistled. "You could get fired for going?" Teresa nodded. "I can't sit by and watch, Jess. It's gotten to the point where I feel like I've got to do something." I lay down on my belly in the cool sand. "It's funny to hear you talk like this, you know. I didn't realize before how different our jobs are. All this stuff's going on where you work. It doesn't touch us at the factory, except when one of the guys gets drafted or killed." Teresa nodded. "I know, honey. This is the first time in my life I've had a job where I can see what's going on in the world. All day long, I hear people arguing about things that are happening. I used to just listen, but now I care. Now I've got feelings about what's going on, and I want to help to try to change things." I held up one hand to stop her. "Slow down, honey." I flopped over on my back. I wondered why her words scared me so much. "Is that why you brought me out here today? To talk to me about this?" I shielded my eyes from the sun to watch her face. She shook her head. "I brought you out here so you wouldn't call Ed right away. Not till we talked first." I frowned. "Why?" Teresa smiled and lay so close I could feel her breath on my ear. "You know, one of the things I liked best about you when I first got to know you?" I was being handled, but gently, so I didn't mind much. "Tell me," I smiled. Teresa laughed. "You were always the peacemaker. Whenever the butches got tanked up and hot under the collar, you found a way to step in and diffuse things. I even noticed that sometimes when two of the older butches would get mad at each other, they would drift over to you one at a time and you'd talk to each of them and there wasn't a fist fight." I turned my head to look at her. "There's a point here, I'll bet." Teresa squeezed my arm. "That's one of your strengths, the way you soothe people when they're mad at each other. Sticking together is really important sometimes, but not always." I sat up. "What do you mean?" Teresa sat up next to me. "Sometimes you have to take sides." I reached for my cigarettes and lit one. Teresa took it from my hand. I lit another for myself. "Sides on what?" I asked her. Teresa ran her fingers through my hair. "Where you stand on the war, for one thing. If you come out against the war, you'll have to take on some of the old butches. And I think that's going to be very hard for you." I sighed. "Of course I'm against the war. Who's for war?" Teresa sighed. "Some of the butches are for the war, honey. Are you sure you're really against all wars? Are there any wars you feel differently about?" I did a double take. "Like what?" Teresa took a long drag on her cigarette. "Ed feels like she's in a war here at home. You haven't seen the news yet. Cities are burning, the troops in the streets." I shrugged. "That's different." Teresa nodded. "Yeah, it is. You have to figure out where you stand." I exhaled smoke and watched the wind lift it up and away. Teresa watched my face with obvious concern. "I'm just saying be careful, honey. Think first before you talk to Ed or anybody else about what happened last night." I listened to the seagulls' caws. Teresa tugged on my arm, demanding my response. I'm listening. I'm glad you didn't let me call Ed all half-cocked. Everything's changing so fast. Sometimes I understand what's going on, and then I lose the thread again. I'll think about it. I just don't know what to think. Teresa kissed my lips. That's a great answer. You'll figure it out. You always try to do what's right. I dropped my eyes. Teresa lifted my chin with her hand. She asked me with her eyes what I was feeling. I'm just scared, I told her. All this stuff hasn't really hit me until now. But all of a sudden, I'm realizing how much you've been changing, and it scares me to death. I'm afraid you're changing, and I'm not. Teresa pulled me down on top of her. I glanced around to see if anyone was around. We were alone. Jess, Teresa whispered. Don't be afraid to let me change. We're all changing. Who knows? You could end up changing so much you'd leave me behind. I laughed at her words. Never, I promised. That'll never happen. Before I could turn the apartment door key in our lock, Teresa opened it. How did it go? She asked me. I shrugged. It was hard. I talked to Jan first. She said pretty much the same thing I did to you. We shouldn't be fighting each other. But she agreed Grant could be a real pain. Teresa led me to the couch. Did you talk to Meg? Yeah. Jan came with me. We talked to Meg before anyone else showed up to the meeting. I told Meg even if she barred the Black Butches and Queens that I wasn't going to keep the peace because I would have jumped in Grant's face over the shit she said too. Jan backed me up. Teresa smiled. Did you mention me? I laughed. Not at that point. I told Meg by the time she excludes everyone who might be offended by Grant when she's drunk, she may as well shut down the bar. I said it would make a lot more sense to bar Grant when she's plowed. Teresa nodded. I lit a cigarette. So, she urged. Then what? I sighed. I said it wasn't just about me and Ed being friends. I told Meg I didn't think she handled it right. She said she's got a business to run. I said I know that, but I wouldn't go to an all-white bar. Teresa slapped my shoulder. Good for you, goddammit. Right on. Anyway, when Grant got there, she apologized for taking out her anger at her brother's death on everybody else. Teresa nodded. Good. I shook my head. Well, it wasn't enough, really. She wouldn't say she was sorry for the racist shit she said. Grant shook Ed's hand. Ed told me to let it go for now. Teresa jiggled my arm. Did you and Ed talk? I smiled. Yeah. We went over to her house afterward. I told Edwin I love her. She's my friend. I said the world was changing faster than I am, and I need to do some catching up in order to understand. Ed talked to me for a couple of hours. Teresa began kneading my shoulders. It felt so damn good. What did she talk about? I tried to remember. So much stuff that it's hard for me to put it all together and tell you. You know, I always fall back on assuming that what Ed and I deal with every day as butches is pretty much the same, you know? Ed reminded me about what she faces every day that I don't. Teresa smiled and nodded. What did you say? I shook my head. I didn't say anything. I listened as hard as I could. Look what Ed gave me. I showed Teresa the copy of The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. Teresa read the inscription. To my friend Jess, love, Edwin. Ed dotted the I in her name with a little heart. When Teresa looked up, I saw tears in her eyes. She pulled my head down and kissed me all over my face. I love you too, Jess, she whispered in my ear. Teresa and I both heard the commotion outside the bar at once. She put down her beer bottle and ran outside. I grabbed our bottles in case we needed to break them to use as weapons. We both stopped dead in our tracks outside. Justine was on her knees. A cop stood over her. His club hung loosely at his side. I saw the blood streaming down the side of Justine's face. It was a sultry, hot evening in July. A number of people had drifted outside the bar in order to drink their beers. 2 cop cars were parked in front of the bar. 4 cops faced us. Get inside, all of you, one of the cops barked. None of us moved. The cop standing over Justine grabbed a handful of her hair. On your feet, he ordered. She stumbled as she tried to rise and fell back onto the concrete. Teresa slipped off her high heels. Take your hands off her, Teresa told the cop. Her voice was low and calm. Leave her alone. Teresa walked slowly toward the cop with the high heels at her sides. I held my breath. Georgetta took off both her stilettos and then held one in each hand. She walked over to Teresa. They exchanged a look I couldn't see and stood side by side. The cop put his hand on his gun butt. Somehow, we all knew instinctively that none of the Butches should move. I heard Peach's voice. "What's going on out here?" We glanced at each other. "Uh-oh," she said. Teresa's voice was low like a moan. "Leave her alone." She and Georgetta inched forward until they flanked Justine. Teresa's arm draped across Justine's hunched shoulders. Justine grabbed Teresa and Georgetta's arms and pulled herself to her feet. When Justine wobbled, Teresa wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her. The cop unholstered his gun. "You fucking slut," he sputtered at Teresa. "You fucking perverts," he shouted at all of us. Another cop pulled on his arm. "Come on, let's get out of here." Slowly, the 4 cops retreated. I exhaled as the cops drove away. Teresa and Georgetta held Justine in their arms as she cried. I started to rush to Teresa, but Peaches wrapped her arm around my shoulder. "Give 'em a minute, honey," she advised. We formed a large circle around them. Teresa turned and fell into my arms. I could feel her body trembling. "Oh God, are you okay?" I whispered into her hair. She buried her face in my neck. "I'm not sure yet. I'll let you know in a few minutes." "I thought he was going to shoot you," I told her. Teresa nodded. "I was so scared, Jess." I smiled. "I'm so proud of you." Teresa studied my face. "Really? I was afraid you'd think it was a really stupid thing to do." I shook my head. "You were really brave." "I was very scared," she sighed. I smiled. "Somebody once told me that being brave means doing what you gotta do, even though you're scared." Teresa looked up at me. "Do you get scared, Jess?" Her question stunned me. "Are you kidding? I'm scared all the time." She nodded. "I thought you must be, but this is the first time you've ever said it to me." "Really? Don't I talk to you about how I feel?" Teresa bit her lower lip and shook her head. My face burned. "I thought you knew." She nodded. "I do know sometimes, most of the time, but you never talk about it." I said, "I don't have any words, honey. I don't know how to talk about what I feel. I don't know if I even feel things like other people do." Peaches gently pulled Teresa away from me. "Come on, y'all. We're going to buy Georgetta and Teresa drinks till they can't stand up." Ed arrived at the bar 20 minutes later. "I missed it," she shouted. "Oh shit, why couldn't I have been here?" I laughed. "Be glad you weren't. It could have gone another way. It was right on the edge." Jan clapped me on the shoulder. "Yeah, but the femmes showed them tonight. Don't mess with us. It was like what happened in Greenwich Village a couple weeks ago." I frowned. "What happened?" "Stonewall!" Grant shouted. I looked at Ed and shrugged. Jan grinned. "The cops tried to raid a bar in Greenwich Village, but they got a fight instead. The drag queens and he-she's really kicked ass." Grant laughed. "I heard they tried to burn the bar down with the cops barricaded inside." I sighed. "Shit, I wish I had been there." "Yeah," Ed thumped her fist on the bar. "That's how I feel about missing what happened tonight." My friends converged on me the moment I set foot inside of Abba's. Ed looked as excited as I was. "Let's see the ring," she said. I looked around. "Is Teresa here yet?" Ed shook her head. "Not yet. Come on, hurry up." I pulled the silk handkerchief out of my inside jacket pocket and opened it. The gold band was studded with a tiny diamond and 2 small ruby chips. Everyone made the same sound at once. "Ooh." Ed patted me on the shoulder. "How long you 2 been together?" "Close to 2 years." Ed laughed. "And how long you had that ring on layaway?" I smiled and shrugged. "A long damn time. Is everybody ready?" Edwin nodded. "Jan and Frankie are in the bathroom getting ready. They couldn't get white dinner jackets, so we all got cream color. Is that okay?" I beamed. "It's all right with me if they all look as good as you do." Ed cuffed my shoulder. I fretted. "Does everyone know their part?" Ed laughed. I've been practicing Blue Moon so much around the house. Darlene said her Valentine present could be to never hear that song again. Frankie and Jan came out of the bathroom. Holy cow, I called over to them. You guys look great. It was the truth. They beamed. Peaches pushed her way through the crowd. Look, she smiled proudly. She held up a huge cardboard full moon painted blue. Peaches flipped it over. The other side was gold. I did a double take. How come the face of the man in the moon looks so much like you, Peaches? Peaches drew herself up to her full height. Where do you see a damn man? The moon is femme, child. High in the sky, femme. And don't you forget it. I checked my watch. Damn, Teresa will be here any minute. Jan and Meg headed straight for me. They looked upset. Meg spoke first. Oh, Jess, I feel awful about this. My stomach clenched. What? Meg rubbed her forehead. I set up the phonograph in the back. Jan was going to rehearse that dip-de-dip thing at the beginning. The needle slid across the record. At first I thought it was okay, but it's not. I looked at Ed. What's she saying? Ed winced. I think she's saying we don't have music. What? I panicked. Oh man, this is all fucked up now. Jan took me by the shoulders and turned me to face her. Jess, take a deep breath. I did. This is Valentine's Day. That's a high femme holy holiday. You've been planning this thing for a long time now. Are you gonna let it all go down the drain? I pouted. What the fuck can I do? Jan smiled. You can sing to your girl. You mean really sing? In my own voice? Ed nodded empathically. Yeah, we can give you a do-a-do backup. Jan, I pleaded. I can't sing worth a damn. Jan smiled. I know, but this whole thing is about having the guts to tell Teresa how much you love her. Edna once told me there's nothing a butch can do to prove her love more than to risk looking foolish. I'm not saying I can do it, but I'm passing that along. What scared me was I knew Jan was right, and I knew I was going to do it. Justine kissed me on the cheek. Teresa's here, she whispered in my ear. Frankie, Jan, and Ed took their positions in front of the bar. I hid behind it. Meg knelt down next to me. I'm sorry, kid, she said. I waved my hand. Forget about it. If I live through this, I could care less. After a long silence, Jan's voice boomed out. She remembered every dip-de-dip and ding-a-dong-ding before she slid into the deep bass Blue Moon. I emerged from behind the bar. It was the look on Teresa's face that gave me the courage to raise my voice. You saw me standing alone. My voice cracked and pitched with embarrassment and emotion. Teresa chewed her lower lip and cried. Do-wah-do, my friends backed me up. Peaches stood behind me, waving the painted blue moon back and forth in a wide arc over my head. But then you suddenly appeared before me. I extended my hand toward Teresa, and when I looked, the moon had turned to gold. Peaches flipped the moon to the gold side. Everyone cheered. Peaches curtsied and continued swaying with the moon. Teresa reached for me. I finished the song dancing in her arms. I realized it was true. I wasn't alone. I had love of my own. Do-wah-do. The chorus was soft and smooth. I pulled the handkerchief from my breast pocket and opened it carefully. Teresa lost it when she saw the ring. I cried, too. The moment really was perfect. I slid the ring on her finger. I had a speech all prepared about how much she meant to me, but I couldn't remember the words. I love you, I told her. I love you so damn much. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Teresa whispered. She took my left hand in hers and ran her thumb lightly over the scar on my ring finger. I want you to wear a band, too. I shook my head sadly. I thought about it, but I'd be too scared. I think if the cops ever took that ring from me, I'd just go berserk. Teresa touched her cheek. If you're afraid to lose what you love, you'll never be able to let go and feel it. I'll put all my love for you in a ring if you'll wear it. And if someone ever takes it from you, all they'll be able to steal is a metal band. Then they'll go out and I'll get you another ring and put all my love in that one. That way you'll never lose it, Jess. Okay? I nodded and buried my face in her neck. Do-wah-do. Everyone in the whole bar sang to us as we swayed to their music. It was the sweetest moment of my life.